This is Jeff Mucci with RCR Wireless News. Thank you for joining us in December, our holiday season, for the 2016 Analyst Prediction Day. We've got 10 analysts lined up, and we're going to be covering everything from connected home to NFV, SDN, analytics, and IoT. Our first guest today is Jason Marcheck, who's with Current Analysis. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
So you're going to be predicting what's going to happen next year in NFV, analytics, and you've got one more topic. What's the third one?
I think we'll look at 5G as it feeds into M2M and IoT. What I cover specifically and what my team covers is really the telecom network, and
right.
So, obviously SDN and NFV is a big deal. Analytics has always kind of been in the background. There's been probes in the network as long as there's been networks. But we're starting to see some movement around, I guess, drivers that the operators are latching onto in terms of quality of experience and things that they need to do to serve their customers better.
Right.
Really, that make analytics part and parcel to the ability to deliver on that. And then 5G, I think, is sort of a topic that most people want to talk about. And then, how that feeds into M2M and IoT and supports those use cases, I think is going to be a big deal in 2016.
Well, let's dive in with software-defined networks, and we have it as a category at RCR Wireless, and we put NFV underneath it. But
sure.
What are your predictions for SDN and NFV?
Well, I think that we're lucky in the telecom industry right now to have such a diverse, kind of number of topics that are really important for carriers to really dive into in a big way in 2016. I think SDN and NFV fall squarely in that bucket. For the last 3 years, we've obviously been talking about it a lot. We've been going to a lot of conferences. A lot of people have been trying to learn about it. I think what we're going to see in 2016 is commercialization and what needs to happen in order to commercialize a lot of this stuff is going to really come into focus. We've seen obviously the big carriers, and they've talked about commercializing selective network functions, even going back to late 2014. So we're seeing AT&T, they have basically carrier Ethernet on demand that's supported by some virtual network functions. DT has some services over in Europe where they're supporting virtual firewalls to small to medium business customers in a pan-European footprint, again, being supported by virtual network elements. And you're seeing some other things come into play. Voice over LTE rollouts, I think, in some cases are starting to be supported by virtual IMS type solutions. And so there's movement, but I think what we're seeing is a lot more operators getting a lot more serious about the steps that they need to take to commercialize. And I think, the sort of flip side of that is that as they get more into and recognize the need to move on commercialization, then some really hard questions are being asked. And what we've heard is ROI questions are something that if you're not AT&T or you're not Telefonica or DT or NTT and have the ability to really kind of drive the ecosystem, then it becomes a matter of how are the smaller operators going to realize incremental benefits that are associated with deploying this stuff. We've heard for a long time. We know that there's operational savings to be had. We know that down the road there's capital, efficiencies to be had. In the near term, that's not necessarily the case, and so there is an upfront investment required. That what the operators want to see and what they want to hear from their vendors and understand is, how do I make money off this as I'm rolling these things out? Because they have other investment priorities. LTE is not pervasive yet. So there's a lot of carriers around the world that are still trying to build out their LTE networks. Even in the United States, where LTE is somewhat pervasive, they still need to focus on network densification, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of back office transformation. We could go on and on. There's a lot of investment priorities that these guys have that have to deal with serving their existing customers today. And so if they're going to go into something like SDN and NFV and make an investment, they want to understand how they're going to begin earning a return in the near term. And I think what that means is that the vendors have an opportunity, but also a mandate to show them, hey, there's virtual EPC, right? But there are dozens of functions within the EPC that can be virtualized. And I think, AT&T is a good example of this. They don't have a fully virtualized mobile packet core, But whenever they're trying to, or a fully virtualized, CPE situation, but whenever they're trying to provision new services, they can do DNS lookups, basically on virtualized hardware, and that saves a lot of money. Right. So that's a good example of incremental progress, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that going forward in 2016. I think we're going to have to, for vendors to keep selling this stuff, and for the the adoption curve to keep to kind of keep rolling up.
So you had a couple questions here, not feeling the pain. They have to plan for it, yeah.
Yeah.
But what's going to be the catalyst that's going to put them over the top? What's the pain point or thorn in their side that's actually going to spur them to make the investment and make the transition?
Well, I think it's different for every operator. I think that once the market is really tracking some of these large operators because they're using them as the test case and the sort of the guide to see how they go about things. I think whenever you see AT&T being able to deliver services, kind of the use case that everyone's talking about now is you have a remote office. Jeff's here in Austin. Whenever you open RCR Europe, you want to spin up that office quickly. So you basically are able to kind of order, provision a circuit, and then you have your remote office up and running.
So unified communications and other enterprise-oriented services.
But just the ability, the ability to, spin up or support virtual or remote locations quickly. That's the main use case. There's a lot of questions behind that, but I think once you see AT&T being able to deliver carrier Ethernet services on demand, when they roll out, internet on demand next year and move into full bandwidth on demand down the road, I think that'll be something that that operators can look at and say, okay, we sort of have a playbook on how to do this. I think as you start to support things, M2M use cases in particular, EPC, virtualized EPC, and other things become extremely interesting when you can support low-end use cases like just connecting unintelligent terminals together. You don't have to dedicate all the CapEx required to support that. If you can do that on COTS hardware and kind of spin it up and down, then that makes sense. Similarly, high-end use cases, I think that's a little bit further down the road when we get to the real heavy-duty M2M and IoT stuff. But I think those are the types of things that are going to spur investment. And then, as I was saying before, I think the thing that the vendors have to do is to help them, number one, define a path where they see the destination.
Right.
But also, figure out steps along the way where they can begin earning a return. How do you support an enterprise service, that you would only be able to support or offer to a, Fortune 1000 company because of the cost structure, and now you can offer it to the SMB market.
Got it.
I think those types of things are going to be, those are going to be the triggers that really key investment.
Well, before we move on to Telecom Analytics, give us your biggest, wildest prediction on NFV for next year.
My biggest, wildest prediction? Well, I think there's a couple things. I think that you are going to see a lot more commercial announcements. So I don't know if it's 20, 40, 100, but you are going to see, a lot. I think you're going to see a lot more commercial announcements than we have in 2015. So that's a good thing. The next thing that has to be solved, and I think there's going to be a lot of momentum around it, a lot of activity around it. I don't know how much progress is going to be made, is all the kind of questions that still need to be answered around orchestration, in both SDN orchestration and NFV Mano orchestration. There's a lot of standards activity going on. There's a lot of questions about how much orchestration is needed and at what point and who supplies that. And I think you're going to see a lot of activity around that because it's a problem that really needs to be solved.
Got it.
You don't necessarily need a ton of orchestration right now to support a VNF, but once you start to spin up a bunch of VNFs and have them work together and then want to provision services over them, then you need a lot of levels of orchestration, and that is really one of the key battlegrounds, I think, right now in the vendor community, and it's something that operators are looking keenly at.
Let's jump into analytics.
Sure.
So what are your prognostications for 2016 around Telecom Analytics?
Yeah, I think that, as I mentioned earlier, I think that analytics have been around, and in the telecom network, and I think this is sort of the bugaboo with analytics in general, is there is a lot of data, there's a lot of stuff you can do with the data. How to harness that data has always been, to make money off of it has always been kind of the question mark. I think from a telecom network perspective, what operators have really latched onto and really embraced is the idea of end user quality of experience as a big differentiator. it's a powerful tool in their toolkit to retain customers and then also to take customers away from their competitors. And if you're going to deliver on this, and especially we're not talking about network uptime. We're talking about if I'm wherever I am on my phone and I initiate a data session, that data session happens. In order to capture that, in order to make that happen, in order to guarantee or provide a high level of experience for down to the individual user level, you're going to need analytics. And so I think that the idea or the recognition that quality of experience and network quality is going to be a key differentiator and a key ability for operators to monetize their network assets. That's I think that's going to be a big deal. And I think that so we're looking at proactive care solutions. We're looking at new service enablement. We're looking at contextual experiences. None of that stuff is really possible to the extent that it needs to happen without advanced analytics. And so I think that that's going to be a pretty big deal. I think that supporting NFV is also going to be a big deal. I think that if we all agree that physical networks and virtual networks are going to kind of coexist for a very long time, and coexist in a way that is not two separate networks running in parallel, but networks running kind of in concert with each other, then you need analytics on the OSS level.
Both systems merged together.
Exactly, to make that happen. So I think that you're going to see that on from the telco OS perspective. And then on the network monetization thing, I think that what we're seeing is that it's somewhat difficult for an operator or a vendor specifically to drive demand down. You're going to have to see demand pulled through. And what we're seeing is, stakeholders that maybe you would not have thought of or even kind of associate with telecom are coming to the vendors or coming to the operators, advertising firms, for example, and saying, hey, I have a customer, I have a client. How can I, use your network, use your data to help them, very specific use cases. So I think what we're going to see is that you'll start to see use cases emerge, and once they're successfully implemented, then you'll kind of have sort of a mushrooming effect. And I think you'll start to see those use cases in 2016. We're hearing already about how individual vendors are working with individual operators, being driven or being led by an advertising firm or some consortium of retail establishments. So I think that that's something that's going to be pretty important on the monetization front and the subscriber analytics front.
So who's going to win the analytics game in terms of providing services to the telcos? You've got the traditional OEMs that want to play in this space. You've got the traditional software companies that are obviously want to play in this space. You've got the test and measurement companies like Viavi and others that are moving up the stack to offer more analytics. Who are the carriers going to turn to for the analytic solutions they need to deliver on these promises?
So the constituency that we work most closely with are the OEMs, and I think I think it's going to be an ecosystem. I mean, all the folks,
be a new player come in, a new set of analytics.
There could be, yeah. I mean, there's a bunch of new entrants coming in. I think the thing that resonates with me is that a network equipment provider they still know telecom networks better than anybody else. So while the test and measurement guys are going to be important because you're going to have them in your ecosystem, while the specialists who make probes and have databases behind them and have interesting algorithms, that's interesting technology. But I still think that there's a key role for the big OEMs to play, and number one, coordinating that ecosystem, because I don't think that's something that operators necessarily have the appetite for. We hear about, we have all this stuff, how do we use it, right? So there's a key opportunity there for the OEM to come in and not only play that coordinating role within the supplier ecosystem, but also play kind of a prime type of an SI or consulting role. I think that's where they're going to do a lot of battle with the Accentures and IBMs of the world, because IBM's starting and Accenture and all those folks, HP, are starting from a position of strength there. And one of the things that I personally follow is the managed and professional services offerings that vendors take to market, and a lot of success with that is just processes. How many engagements have you done? How much IP can you bring to an engagement? So number one, you make money, but also so the customer doesn't get frustrated. IBM has these models down. They've been doing this for so long. So I think that I think it's kind of wide open, but I think a key battleground is going to be how the Nokias, Ericsson, Huawei's of the world, you know, are able to compete with the IBMs and Accentures of the world for some of that consulting and SI work, because that's, in a lot of ways, it's somewhat simplistic, but that's really what's going to be kind of the glue that makes everything come together.
Okay. Let's move into 5G. I know in 2015, early in the year, starting with Mobile World Congress, you saw a lot of big announcements of companies that are going to focus on 5G. And then you had several months of people saying, what is 5G?
Right.
So, you know, where are we today and what are you forecasting for 2016?
So I'll kind of couch this by saying this was, you know, late 2013, early 2014. A guy that works for me, Ed Gubbins, the phrase that he was pretty fond of using is, you know, the first thing that you have to understand about 5G, to understand 5G, is to recognize that there is no such thing as 5G. I think that's changing, right? I mean, I think a lot of definitions are starting to happen. I think that the industry is starting to come to agreement on what exactly is 5G. It's not just a new radio interface, it's a set of technologies, it's multi-access. You know, it has to do with how you use spectrum, it has to do with how you coordinate and densify networks and things of that nature. It's how you pull in OSS and BSS. So I think that is, you know, coming into focus. I also think that, you know, as the slide says, it's not just about more data, it's about more everything. It's about lower latency, it's about more connectivity, it's, you know, ubiquitous connectivity and things of that nature. So I think that, you know, it's just a foundational level. There's a lot more clarity than there was a year ago. What does that mean for commercial deployments? I mean, not too much in 2016, I don't think. I mean, honestly, I think that, you know, the vendors are going to have to continue to message their roadmaps. And that's why we're seeing a lot of vendors talk about this concept of 4.5G, or, you know, that's a marketing term that's fairly vendor specific, but, you know, and the idea is increasing the network densification. It is making incremental steps towards reducing latency. It's about introducing technologies, whether it's, you know, MIMO or whether it's network slicing, to kind of lay the foundation for 5G when, you know, it really starts to hit in 2017, 18, 19 and beyond. So I think in 2016 what we're going to see is a lot more, you know, the messaging from on the vendor side is going to get more sophisticated. The requirements from the operator side are going to get more sophisticated. But from a pragmatic perspective, I think you're going to see a lot more focus on network densification. And that's really an all hands on deck approach. I think that, you know, there's a sort of a default to, well, that means small cells. And small cells are going to play a role, but DAS is going to play a role, Wi-Fi is going to play a role, you know, MIMO on the macro sites are going to play a role. So I think that what you're going to see is all of that stuff come together. And I think, you know, it's not just as easy to say, you just put a bunch of all that out there and all of a sudden you have a dense network. You have to make it all work together. And so I think that on the network densification subject, that's what I see in 2016 being a big deal. I see a lot of those things, you know, more small cells, more DAS, more, you know, everything else kind of coming together and really laying the groundwork for, you know, the use cases that are going to be, or that 5G are going to have to be there to support. You know, we're never going to be talking about autonomous cars and things of that nature until we have a very low latency, ubiquitous network. There's a lot of steps that need to happen, and I think network densification is one of the steps that's going to happen this year.
Well, two things. We're the broadcast partner for the Texas Wireless Summit that University of Texas puts on every year, and it seems that they tend to focus a lot on 5G being millimeter wave technology. But there seems that 5G is not limited to just the upper spectrum. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's all. I mean, just as it's not necessarily it's fixed access, it's mobile access, it's, you know, multiple inputs, outputs on the air interface. It's also using all the spectrum assets, and that's what network slicing is a big deal. I think that we're seeing a lot of activity around how to get creative using spectrum, whether it's the low end, sort of the beachfront property type stuff, or the very high end. If you're going to get to a ultra low latency, you know, ultra dense, ubiquitous connectivity, you're going to have to get very creative on spectrum usage. And I'm not really an expert on all of those, you know, ways of doing that, but I do know that, you know, we're definitely not done in seeing innovation on that front. And
Right.
that's why, the stuff that the University of Texas is doing and all those other research research institutions are doing are important, because it's not just a physics question, it's a business question. The carriers in the US get, they kind of like to hammer on the FCC about, well, they're not releasing enough spectrum and this, that, and the other thing. The other side of that coin is it really forces the industry to get creative, and I think that that's something that has to ultimately happen.
Okay, two other things real quickly before we move on to the next panel. We're seeing a trend where it appears as though industrial IoT use cases are stepping stones to 5G. They're like many use cases for different parts of 5G. What's your opinion on industrial IoT use cases as being part of the 5G umbrella?
I think it just makes sense in general. You know what I mean? Like, I think that in the telecom industry, you have this kind of answers looking for problems to solve, and that it's good stuff and it's interesting. It makes great trade show fodder, but you have to have demand behind all of this stuff to make it work. And I see, as you get comfortable with a use case, right? As you work out all the bugs. I mean, this stuff doesn't just get rolled out and happen. There's a reason why ATM to IP took 20 years. There's a lot of iterative steps, and I think these use cases are ways for the entire ecosystem to get comfortable with the requirements that have to happen to make that use case work. And then once you have that, it's kind of a learning that you can then take and apply more broadly. So in general, I think it's a good, but I absolutely agree that, and you have to have someone to fund this as well. And so, these use cases, there's real demand behind it. There's real people writing checks, and so I think it's iterative and it's kind of accumulative.
Okay, so 5G 2016 prediction?
Network densification. It's not going to be 5G. It's going to be 4.5G or whatever you want to call it. But network densification, I think, is going to be the thing.
Well, Jason, thanks for joining us today. We've got
Absolutely.
James Brim coming up in a few minutes. He's going to be talking about monetization. He's going to be talking about the next killer app. But Jason, thanks for joining us this morning.
Appreciate it.